A very good afternoon to everyone, and welcome to this webinar on inclusive contract drafting after COVID-19. Uh, I'll now call upon Mr. Alok Chattopadhyay of the ICC Kolkata branch to give the opening address. Mr. Chattopadhyay, over to you, sir.
Yeah, thank you. Good afternoon, everybody, all the distinguished guests and our speakers to this program. Today, we are going to host this program, Inclusive Contract Drafting after COVID-19. And in this is going to happen with the association of the Khaitan and Company, who needs no further introduction. And in today's program, actually, we will be hearing Mr. Supratim Chakraborty, partner, Khaitan and Company, Mrs. Shuhana Islam Mursaid, partner, Khaitan and Company, and Nandini Khaitan, partner in Khaitan and Company. Today's e-seminar will mainly be evolving through contract drafting and particularly to special clauses in the contract. That inclusion of force majeure clause, because now after COVID-19, this has become a very burning issue, because in many cases this is being allowed, this is not allowed unless it was mentioned very categorically. All these things are coming up. So that will be dealt with very efficiently by our lawyers panel. And another issue is also there, that in case there is a dispute, how to resolve it outside the court, how can we resolve it? The best method in that case is will be through arbitration under the Arbitration and Reconciliation Act 1996 and as amended in 2017. So all these things and very interesting things will be now listening from our panelists. So with this, I declare this session open and hand it over to Ms. Nandini Khaitan.
Thank you, sir. I'll just quickly explain. There will be two parts to this webinar. For the first about 60 to 90 minutes, the three panelists will make individual presentations, and this will be followed by 30 to 40 minutes of live Q&A. You can keep sending us your questions throughout the duration of this webinar using the questions box in your webinar portal, and we will take all your questions towards the end. If we cannot answer your questions live today, we will get back to you over email. And a copy of this presentation and the recording will be emailed to you a few days after this webinar. With this, I call upon Supratim to take over the webinar.
Thank you, Tejas. A very warm welcome to all of you, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you very much for your collective time today. As you know, the topic of our session today is inclusive drafting post-COVID-19. Well, the pandemic today has not only introduced us to new ways of operating in our daily lives, working and carrying on our business, but it has also led to a paradigm shift in legal practice, and that we are observing day in and day out now. We now have hearings in virtual courts, and we are also taking a very close look at our existing contracts to understand its ramifications in today's time. So with this in view, ICC, in collaboration with our firm Khaitan and Company, have put together this masterclass on contract drafting for you. And bear with us, some parts of it would be extremely interesting. Some part may seem to go a little slow, but the reason why it would be is to explain to you the great details and nuances that are involved, which would be critical for you at this hour and also going forward from here onwards. So through our presentation, the speakers will again touch upon certain key elements and considerations that you should keep in mind while drafting watertight agreements, and will also take you through certain critical clauses with a magnifying glass. Needless to add, we will bring in and talk about specific COVID-19 related aspects and considerations wherever applicable. We truly hope that you will all enjoy and, more importantly, gain from this session. Allow me to now briefly introduce our speakers. Firstly, Nandini Khaitan. She is a partner with the Disputes Resolution Practice Group in our Calcutta office. Nandini has 16 years of experience in commercial, environment, intellectual property, real estate, and family disputes litigations. She has appeared at every level of the Indian judicial system, including Supreme Court, High Courts, National Company Law Tribunals, National Green Tribunal, having worked extensively with two chartered high courts of the country, that is Bombay and Calcutta. She is thorough in the nuances of litigation across the country. She is admitted to practice law under Bar Council of West Bengal and New York, USA. Next speaker is my partner Suhana, who's in the corporate and commercial practice group of Khaitan and Company. Her core expertise includes private equity investments, mergers, acquisitions, business transfers, joint ventures, and foreign investments. Her work experience in M&A and private equity has spanned several sectors such as FMCG, retail, manufacturing, information technology, IT-enabled services, so on and so forth. Suhana is also involved in the firm's startup initiative and actively engages with startups through various forums. Finally, talking about myself, I'm a partner in the corporate and commercial practice group of Khaitan and Company. I specialize in corporate and commercial transactions such as mergers, acquisitions, joint ventures, and general corporate law advisory. I also specialize in information technology laws, including data privacy and cybersecurity. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, I will get started with my piece of this presentation. So this is the quick agenda so that you are aware of the route map, the way we will take you through. First, I will talk about a bit on the COVID-19 contracting aspects. Then contracts 101, which is introduction, how the look and feel of contracts are, certain key terms, and then we will get into granular study. This will be taken up by my colleague Suhana, granular study of certain key clauses, representations and warranties, covenants, indemnity, things that we fight most whenever we are drafting or negotiating a contract, limitations of liability, confidentiality, etc. Then we will talk about post-COVID-19 considerations for considerations and material adverse change. This is another area where we see a lot of fight happening as far as transactions are concerned. We will also talk about the most important force majeure clause and the principles and the drafting, how you should look at it, how it is being seen today, what you should be taking care of going forward. And finally, drafting of an arbitration agreement, the key elements that you should keep in mind. The last pieces would be taken up by my colleague, Nandini Khaitan. With that, let's get started. So COVID-19 contracting has, the changes that are occurring and will continue to occur are these. Okay, there is a total change in perspective of contracting and contract drafting. You would see all around. Every contract in near future possibly would be end-to-end digital. You are aware that at present there are certain embargoes because of the negative list that is there in the Information Technology Act, which states that certain things cannot be done through the digital mode, and therefore wills, things like real estate related documents, these things are not possible to be carried out or transacted through digital mode. There is a sea change which is in pipeline, and there are talks that this should now give way to full digital mode of execution end to end. And we see a lot of change. Earlier we used to do due diligence for transactions where we were given a physical data room, and there we used to sit and prepare our notes. But slowly we saw a transition to virtual data rooms, and information was used to be uploaded there, and we had to take down details and prepare our due diligence report. That has kind of become the norm. And now what we see is it is not only due diligence which is virtual, first drafts of documents, negotiation, signing, closing, all of this is becoming digital. Well, another important part is you cannot blindly rely on precedents anymore. You cannot copy paste. You have to be very creative. You have to have fresh thinking for each and every clause that is written in the agreement. And that is, I think, a good thing as well, because then you start applying your mind to each element, each clause that is given in a contract. Role of lawyers are also changing, and we need to now step into the shoes of business and operational teams. We need to understand what kind of delays could occur and therefore have buffer time, what kind of issues that could possibly crop up whilst your operational team is acting on a particular transaction, so on and so forth. Drafting style is changing completely. We see clients are preferring for short, less complicated and complex drafts, stating the clear intent so that the time taken to negotiate it, to draft, negotiate, and finalize it is far lesser. From a contracting perspective, from a drafting perspective, what are the watch out areas? Well, you will see very new and innovative clauses evolving. You will also see aspects such as non-disclosure agreements and confidentiality clauses being relooked at, especially in the work from home scenario. You can imagine in the present day scenario, there is no physical check of how data is being handled. And most of this is through logical remote access that your organization may be having over your system. So therefore, whether you are vouching to your customers or you have given the data to your vendors, you need to look both ways and see that the way you had promised to safeguard data or your vendors had promised to safeguard information, is it happening that way or is there a change? And accordingly, are there any changes required to be made in the documents? Aspects such as social distancing, safety measures like, say, staggered staffing, working in shifts, etc., all needs to be considered. You also need to consider, as depending on the contract, consider things like business continuity, disaster recovery, so on and so forth. Also, certain definitions will change quite a bit, like ordinary course of business, confidential information. We'll take you through some of these. Some of them I'll take, some my colleagues would take. Moving on. Before we start drafting, very quick tips. Whether there's a pandemic or no pandemic, keep these in mind. Avoid verbosity, short sentences, readable language, and this I'm telling because we are aware that there are non-lawyers also in this forum who are trying to understand nuances relating to contract and contract drafting. So readable language using familiar words, put words in logical order, avoid negative language, punctuate properly. And finally, and most importantly, proofread or cold read the document at the end before you release. This is a classic example of wrong punctuation, as you can see. Eat panda, eat, shoots, and leaves. How one comma can really make a difference. Let me also tell you another story here from my personal experience. So we were doing a large M&A transaction and we were negotiating for several weeks. One night, suddenly we decided that, okay, now the negotiations are over and we are about to sign the document. The client insisted that let us all sign it tonight. We told that, listen, we have to finally once proofread or cold read the entire set of documents. There was a shareholders agreement, there was a share purchase agreement, so on and so forth. Finally, they agreed that, okay, tonight you read this and tomorrow morning, first thing, all parties will sign this document. I took the documents to my hotel room and started reading. And towards the end, when I was coming to the last document's end, I realized that there was really nothing much that was wrong, and started thinking to myself that maybe I put a spoke in the wheel for no reason. Well, in the last final boilerplate clauses, or one of the standard clauses that are there, it was written that if there is any disconnect between this agreement and the other agreement, this agreement will prevail. And similarly, in the other agreement also, a same clause was there. So imagine in a dispute situation, the catastrophic issue that would have occurred, that both agreements were stating that this will prevail over the other. So we made the change, we sort of changed those paper, and the next morning we had signing. So this is one classic example how proofreading is so important. The final cold read is mandatory. So what are contracts? Remember, this is not a contract law class. This is the contract drafting related masterclass. So just a few snippets we picked up from several places and thought of just showing you how contracts are being perceived. Private body of law governing business relationship between parties, legally expressing the commercial intent beyond business or commercial deal, and it also includes ancillary provisions known as boilerplate or standard clauses. Describes with precision the consensus ad idem or meeting of minds with the goal that every subsequent reader will interpret it in the same manner. Very important. Several times we see documents are drafted in a manner that subsequent reader will interpret it in a different manner. We should try and avoid that. Okay, so whilst there are different forms of agreement, we thought that it may be nice to just show you the look and feel of a contract and what all ideally what all provisions you would see in a contract. This is how you will see the entire flow. And this is also to tell you that how I usually look at it. I look at contracts as a way of storytelling. So whenever I am in colleges, when I'm teaching or otherwise, even to my folks internally, I say that consider this to be, say, a contract of Apple purchases. What would you write? You would tell a story like this, right? So you will have an introduction where you will name the contract. Then you will have the parties who are parties to that arrangement of Apple seller and Apple buyer. Then you will have recitals that what do they want to do. And here, mind you, it is important to mention somewhere that the recitals and schedules are integral part of the agreement, because sometimes there have been litigations in the past, and this is an important aspect to keep in mind. Just a tip for you. Then we will have definitions and interpretation. There are certain words which are used number of times, and therefore we would rather prefer to put it in the definition and use only the defined terms. Interpretation provision is basically the laws of interpreting that particular agreement which we set out. Now, form of drafting agreement is also changing. Sometimes for brevity, we see that the definition and interpretation is parked in the schedule these days. And therefore, it is becoming all the more important to state somewhere that the schedule is an integral part of this particular document, and also be mindful when you are writing that in case of a dispute, which prevails over what. So just ensure that you are taking note of these aspects. Then we will have the operative provision. And what do we do here? We say, well, party A wants to sell Apple, party B wants to purchase Apple. This is the purchase price. This is how it will happen. So that's the operative part. Then you will have representation, warranties, and covenants. So very quickly, my colleague Suhana will take you through in greater detail. But there are two ways of looking at it, right? One is that I tell you that you should purchase these apples for me because for the last 20 years we have been producing the best apples in the country. That is my representation. That is what has happened in the past till today. So it is a vouching for today. And then you have covenants, which is basically forward looking, that if you and I do business, for the next 10 years we will supply the best apples in the market. So that is a forward-looking statement. Many a times we see these getting mixed up and written very ambiguously in drafts. So just a quick tip there. Then we could have conditions precedent and conditions subsequent. Examples could be that I would have to arrange for proper transport system before we get into this arrangement. So that could be a condition precedent. Condition subsequent could be like, after these apples are supplied, we should have a feedback from everyone, and that could be an item mentioned as condition subsequent. Indemnity, again, extremely hardly fought between parties. In very, very crude and short terms, it's like insurance. Okay, so two parties get together and decide what would be lost, how it is to be made good, and all that. And therefore, it is so fiercely fought in almost every agreement. Then you will have termination and effect of termination. Sometimes we see contracts where termination is written, but what happens pursuant to termination is not mentioned. This could be catastrophic again, because suppose you have given some valuable data, and after termination, that data should either come back to you or it should be destroyed. and a certificate should be given to you that should be very clearly spelled out. Just an example. Dispute resolution, of course, is mighty important. And then you have a set of clauses called boilerplate clauses. Now, these are in the lawyer terms, it's called midnight clauses. These are generally picked up from some draft or, drafted at the midnight. And today in the pandemic situation, many of these clauses are becoming the most important clauses, force majeure being one of them. We will talk about some of them. Then you will have the signature page, and then of course schedules, annexures, and exhibits. Let's start with the first part, which is a preliminary starting point of your document, and it could be written like this: that this share purchase agreement, and you define this as an agreement, is entered into at, say, Mumbai on 29th day of May 2020, which is the execution date by and between so and so parties. Now here, few things which are very important. Your execution date or signing date could be different from the effective date or effective date of that agreement. And therefore, suppose you enter into on 29th day of May 2020, or you are signing the document, possibly from 1st of June, you wanted to really have effect, and you separately define that as effective date. That's absolutely fine. Place of execution is also very important for several reasons, including stamp duty payment. Parties, very important again, to understand what kind of party is it. Is it a natural person? Is it a legal person? And what is the intent and type of contract that is happening? And that's how you write the party clause. A typical clause is stated here. So insert the name of the company, suppose it's a company, and insert the type of company, it's a private limited company, etc., organized under or existing under whatever law, maybe Companies Act, with its registered office at so and so place. And hereinafter you are defining it, you refer to as company. You may also include heirs, executors, administrators, successors in interest, and permitted assigns. Now be very careful on this, okay? We have seen sometimes some personal contracts. For example, employment contract is drafted, and all these aspects of heirs, executors, administrators, everything is mentioned. Now you have to be very careful what is written in that document. It's a personal contract where an individual would really perform an activity. Do you really need to write all of this? You should take a relook. Definitions. So this is, as I told you, another very critical part where you do not want to repeat the same thing being told time and again. It reduces unnecessary repetition, and therefore you have a set of definitions which are provided. It's a very powerful tool and represents a true meeting of minds between the parties. But one tip and caution here is, do read the definitions very, very carefully, and do ensure that you see where the defined terms are used. I'll give you a classic error issue that we observe many a times. Business in a business transfer or in a share purchase, we see would be written as business means the business of the company of doing, say, producing, manufacturing pipes. And then we will see in the non-compete clause, it is written that I will not carry out this business. Now, business is that of the company. If you're using the defined term, you will have to write it properly to state this business or any business similar to it, etc., etc. Otherwise, it is infructuous. You are not covering yourself adequately. You are only restricting it to the business of the company the way it is written. I would like to have a wider ambit usually, right, if I'm the acquirer. So just a short point there. Typically, it appears in a separate section, either before the interpretation clause or as an exhibit or schedule, like I told you. Some terms are used within the text of the contract, and in parentheses it is mentioned and not defined in the definition clause. Let me take one example of how you should be careful in the COVID situation with definitions as well. Ordinary course of business, okay, very, very commonly used definition. It says shall mean the ordinary course of business consistent with past customs and practices, but only to the extent consistent with applicable law, blah, blah. Now, if you had in the recent past been sacking people left, right, and center, and that is considered to be ordinary course of business, your new acquirer could be really in trouble. So you have to ensure how craftily you remove the present situation out of it and define ordinary course of business. This particular definition as I told you, consists carve out in standstill obligation. Standstill is basically, say, when you sign the agreement and before you completely take over, pay and take over the company, whether it is a share purchase or asset purchase or business transfer, this period in between, you need to ensure that the business is safeguarded by the sellers properly. So during that time, we usually take a promise from the sellers that you are operating the business in the ordinary course of business. Okay, so you understand how important this clause is. Otherwise, you could have a situation that someone signed a document with you and before handing it over to you, the business is completely leaked out and finished. So this is to guard against that. It grants operational flexibility as well to parties between execution and closing of the transaction. So if the seller really wants to do day-to-day business, they should not be stopped from doing that. Okay. Interpretation clause, I'm not going into great depth, but again, this is very important, and do read it with great clarity, very, very closely, because sometimes we see in the interpretation clause, some slip-ins are made, which results in otherwise misinterpretation or different interpretation of agreements. Operative provisions, well, this is basically where you start telling the story completely, that who is doing what. So A is purchasing apples from B. So this captures the underlying objective of the contract. Try to keep it brief, clear, and to the point. And further details, of course, can be parked in schedules. Let me take one example. Suppose it's a share purchase agreement, and look at it how it is drafted by different parties differently. Suppose you are the you are the seller and you give a draft to the other side. You will only possibly give the dark highlighted bold part, which is stating, subject to the terms of this agreement, on the closing date, ABC shall purchase and acquire, and XYZ shall sell and transfer to ABC the sell shares at the sale price. You will only mention that. But if you are the acquirer, you will add the part in square brackets also, so that you are reaffirming that I am entering into this business because of certain promises, warranties, etc. you have made, and then read how it would be reading in entirety. It will read like, subject to the terms of this agreement, fulfillment of conditions precedent to the satisfaction of ABC, that is the purchaser, and relying on the representation, warranties, covenants, undertakings, and indemnities furnished by XYZ to ABC in this agreement. On the closing date, ABC shall purchase and acquire the sell shares, blah, blah. So with this, I would hand this over to my colleague, Suhana. Over to you, Suhana.
Thank you, Supratim, and thank you to all the participants for joining in today. Supratim had mentioned when he was speaking in his piece that increasingly transactions are becoming more and more complex and documents are getting quite sophisticated. And lawyers are often devising new ways and methods to retell their story through their contract. However, a complex structure or a sophisticated document need not always translate into difficult contract drafting. I'm reminded of a quote by this famous American artist, Will Rogers. He lived around the late 1800s and early 1900s. And he had once remarked that if you read something you can't quite understand, in all likelihood, it is going to be drafted by a lawyer. So unfortunately, this has now become a joke, and most of us lawyers have had to be subject to this at some point in our career. So the aim of today's session really is to take a granular look at some of these critical clauses, and the list is in the screen in front of you, and to deep dive really into some of these concepts and to understand how best to approach them while negotiating it. So this will not only hold true today, but also in a post-COVID situation. Through a process of elimination, we have cherry-picked certain important clauses, and I'm going to try and demystify these and talk about this in the next 30 to 35 minutes of my presentation. So the first aspect I want to talk about is on representations and warranties. Now, interestingly, one exercise we can all do after this session maybe is to pick up any contract that we have available through our work. And you would notice that the term representations and warranties are often clubbed together. They will appear somewhere in the middle of an agreement. To my mind, they really go to the heart of an agreement because a lot of important consequences follow from a breach of a representation or a warranty. Sometimes they will be used interchangeably as well. So representation could mean a warranty and vice versa. But the idea is that they're generally clubbed together. But actually, strictly speaking, under law, these are two very distinct concepts. A representation is not really defined under Indian statute, while a misrepresentation is actually defined under the Indian Contract Act. And the term representation and what it means has developed over the years through jurisprudence and case laws. A representation is nothing but a statement of fact. It could be a past fact that has something that has occurred before, or it is something that relates to a present situation or circumstance. But it is a statement of fact as opposed to a statement of opinion or a forward-looking statement where I'm required to do or not do something. It's simply a statement of fact. But the essential point to remember is that a representation is often made to induce a party to enter into the contract. So it is akin to a very essential condition of a contract because it is inducing the party to enter into it. A warranty, on the other hand, has been defined under the Sale of Goods Act. We come across the term warranty in our day-to-day life. Most electrical items that we buy would have some kind of a product warranty regarding its merchantability, regarding the fact that it is fit for the purpose. So warranty, like we understand, is actually an assurance or a promise that a particular statement I'm making, an assertion I'm making is true, it is accurate and correct. So for example, a health insurance that you may take requires you to give certain warranties that you are of a particular age or that you don't have any pre-existing diseases. These are examples of warranties that you would give. A warranty could either be affirmative in nature, basically it means that it deals with existing facts, or it could be a forward-looking statement. It is something which relates to a future event, a warranty that goes on for a future time. So why is it important to really understand the difference between representations and warranties while it is used interchangeably and together as a common group? Is because of the consequences that arise if there is a misrepresentation or a breach of a warranty. A misrepresentation is nothing but a false representation that has been made. Now note that I had said that a representation is often given to induce a party to enter into the contract. So what that means is that if a party, the aggrieved party, has been induced to enter into the contract on basis of a false representation, they can actually avoid the contract. They can cancel it or rescind it. They can also ask for restitution for unjust enrichment, which basically means restoration of status quo. Or if a representation has been given in a fraudulent manner, they can also ask for damages. A warranty, on the other hand, strictly speaking, is considered to be a collateral agreement, something which is collateral to the main purpose of the agreement. And therefore, a person cannot avoid a contract just because there is a breach of a warranty. All they can do is sue for damages. And this is all the legal remedies that are available under law. So for example, there is a famous case where a person was selling a second-hand car, a used car, and he had represented that the car has done 20,000 miles when actually the car had done over 100,000 miles. And it was held to be a breach of a warranty because it is collateral to the main purpose of the agreement. So this is mainly an academic discussion. And while we notice that most representations and warranties are used together, it is important to understand the distinction that we've just discussed. Also, you may say that it could be a case of bad drafting, that these are clubbed together when they're actually so distinct, but it is actually a case of clever drafting, at least to my mind. The reason being, a lawyer would want, first of all, a lawyer would want that there be no ambiguity on whether a particular statement I'm making be construed as a representation and a warranty. It could be construed as either, depending on the intention of the party, depending on the nature of the contract. It would also ensure that the various consequences and remedies that you have available under law are available, irrespective of the nature of that particular statement and how it is construed. But that said, again, because it is used together, usually the default or the fallout of a misrepresentation or a breach would also be a common element, which would be that of an indemnity, and I'm going to deal with that when I come to it in the later slides. So let's take a few examples of representations and warranties. In the box in blue in front of you, these are 3 representations and warranties that we have taken. I've taken this from a business transfer agreement that we had signed recently. And here there was a seller who was selling his entire business as a going concern on a slump sale basis. And he had represented that as on the date of this agreement, he is the legal and beneficial owner of the assets. The assets are free from encumbrances. This is really a fundamental element, a fundamental representation that any seller would give the buyer if you're selling goods or property or your assets. He also gave certain additional representations, and these are, of course, just by way of example. The representations and warranties can continue for pages and pages. So he had represented, for example, that the accounting books are properly maintained, which means that they're not only properly maintained for that particular year, but historically over time till the date on which this representation has been made. He also said that the accounting books contain all material matters required by law. Now, materiality and the qualification of materiality is an important point to bear in mind, and I'm going to deal with that in some detail in the later slides. So these are just statements of facts like we discussed, and these are commonly found in various agreements, whether it is your M&A related documents or financing, or a simple service agreement or a supply agreement. There is also a concept of a bring down warranty. Now, we must appreciate that representations and warranties are nothing but risk allocation clauses. So what this means is that if I am the acquirer or a buyer or the party to whom, say, some goods or services are being sold, I would want to know, and I would need the assurance that the representation that you're making, the factual statements you're making on a particular date, also hold good at a later date. And this is specifically relevant in cases where there is a certain time lag between the signing of an agreement and the final completion. You can see it in M&A transactions, in share purchase agreements, where you sign it on a particular date and then there are certain conditions to be fulfilled, like Supratim had mentioned, and then you finally go on to completion. So in that case, with the help of a bring down warranty, what the buyer does is that he requires the seller to repeat those representations and warranties and hold them as true and accurate at a future date, which is the date of the completion. So in this example, we had said that the seller warrants to the buyer that the representations are true and accurate and will continue to be true and accurate at all times up to and including completion. So this is actually a much broader version of the bring down warranty, because it says that each day after the date of this agreement, these representations and warranties will be repeated, and each day I am representing and warranting that they are going to be true and accurate. Broadly speaking, we have, it has become practice to categorize representations, warranties in 3 broad buckets, so to speak. The first bucket, I would say, is a fundamental representations and warranties. Fundamental representations, like the word suggests, are really fundamental. They go to the core and the heart of a contract. And you would notice that usually both parties, or there are several parties, all parties would give these representations and warranties, because they're very fundamental. They talk about whether you have the power and authority to enter into the agreement. It talks about whether you have the fact that you're entering into this agreement will not breach applicable law, not breach any other contract to which you're a party. And therefore, it is considered to be fundamental. Also, the treatment and the consequences and the limitation of liability for fundamental warranties, and each of these buckets would differ. So that's why it's important to categorize and to treat them differently. The second category is that of tax warranties. Now, tax warranties is a separate bucket for various reasons. First of all, everybody is worried about the tax. Everybody also is worried about the risk that comes with the tax liability, especially the acquirer, the investor, the buyer. So we have two examples of tax warranties. Again, this was taken from the same BPA that I had mentioned earlier. The seller was representing and warranting that no tax demand is pending. So everything is good up till now. No tax demand is pending was fairly ascertainable for the seller. He was fairly sure that no tax demand was pending. He was able to give this representation as it is. But then it went on to say that no tax demand is threatened. Now here the seller was a bit of a quandary because it was a big company, several branches across India, a big tax department handling different types of claims. So it's not always possible to ascertain whether there is a small threatened notice or some kind of an inkling that there will be a tax demand or proceeding. So the best way to handle such situations is to put in what we call as qualifiers. There can be several types of qualifiers. They can be knowledge qualifiers, materiality qualifiers, or even monetary thresholds. I've given examples of all three of them in these clauses that we have set out here. So here in the first item, we are saying that to the best of the knowledge of the seller, no tax demand is threatened, which basically allows the seller, it allows some kind of flexibility and says, as far as I'm aware, going by a reasonability test, there is no tax demand which is threatened. Similarly, the second tax warranty he had to give is that it is in compliance with all transfer pricing requirements. Again, it was not possible for him to give this representation without any dilution. So we built in what is known as a materiality qualification, and he said that they are in material compliance, which means that if there is some small non-compliance, which is non-material in nature, technically, he would not have breached the warranty, he would not have misrepresented, and therefore the consequences would not follow. Now, the last bucket I want to talk about is others. Others really is a false heading because others includes a lot of subcategories, and depending on the nature of the agreement. So if you have a purchase agreement where you're buying a company or a business, you would want representations and warranties on each and every aspect of the business: the contracts, the employees, the intellectual property, the assets, the books, insurances, everything. But on the other hand, if you're just buying real estate, or suppose you're buying certain goods, or it's a manufacturing contract, your representations and warranties that you would seek under this bucket will be limited. It may be limited, for example, in a manufacturing agreement to the factory premises, to the methods that you employ, good industry practices, and so on and so forth. In this case, the seller was giving a representation that all contracts are adequately and duly stamped. Going by experience, in 9 out of 10 cases, most businesses would not have adequately stamped all their contracts. Your smaller contracts like your AMCs, your small service agreements are more often than not stamped at all. So again, a materiality qualification is very useful in this situation. Again, an example of a monetary threshold that we put in was in the second example under others, where we had said that no loan or advance has been made exceeding 1 lakh rupees. Because the seller had made certain smaller loans and advances, he did not want to disclose all of them separately, and therefore we built in something which allowed him more flexibility. Finally, in this slide, you have certain more examples of these, these qualifications and dilution tools, so to speak. These qualifications only help the person who is giving the representation and warranty, and they allow you to avoid a misrepresentation or a breach for smaller matters, non-essential matters. But just a word of caution here, just because these tools are available does not mean that we overburden any representation and warranty with them. The idea is that these are risk allocation clauses, and therefore the risk should be fairly divided between the buyer and the seller. and there should be some ownership of liability also with the person making this representation and warranty. So it's important to approach it from a very balanced view. Certain other considerations that I've mentioned here are the survival period. How long should a representation warranty survive in case of termination or post-expiry? And also the disclosures that you can make. I've already touched upon disclosures, and I'll deal with survival when I talk about indemnity in a later slide. So the next aspect or critical clause I want to talk about, separate from representations and warranties, are those of covenants. Now, covenants are usually misunderstood in the sense that covenants are not in any manner a warranty. It is a forward-looking statement, but it is a statement which requires you to either do or not do something. So it places an obligation upon you at a future time. So it is very similar to an undertaking that you have given under an agreement. Certain examples of covenants, for example, here would be that the seller, on and from the execution date, the seller will not terminate the employment of any employee. On and from the execution date, the company will not incur any indebtedness. So you see, it requires the seller to do something or not do something. In the first example, the seller is required to pledge their shares. So it's a performance requirement which is at a future date. Now, the only two considerations that I would ask you to keep in mind while negotiating or drafting a covenant is to ensure that you have practicality in mind and also operational flexibility and feasibility. So for example, and this is true again for a situation where you don't have signing and closing of the agreement on the same date, there is a certain time lag. If you are required not to incur any indebtedness, say for a particular period of time, it may not be possible for you to actually carry on business, especially in a time like this where you may want to raise funding. So in this case, if you had the foresight and if you put in certain monetary thresholds, for example, you can say the company will not incur any indebtedness exceeding 20 lakhs, just by way of example, it gives you that flexibility to raise smaller funds and to take smaller loans. So always keep in mind the flexibility that a person may want when giving those covenants. Moving on to the next topic, which again is a very critical and a very major point and highly negotiated in most documents, are those on indemnities and limitation of liability. Now, as we know, the Contract Act already allows you for certain remedies and compensation by way of damages. The Contract Act also talks about indemnities. Now, indemnities is actually a much larger pool than damages, because an indemnity is nothing but a contractual commitment by one party to the other party, and we say that by way of an indemnity, I will indemnify and pay up not only for the loss, plus I can pay up for the costs, expenses, liabilities, damages, taxes, duties, levies, penalties. The list can go on, which is why it's so highly negotiated. So again, an indemnity will require one party, which is the indemnifying party, to pay up to the other party if there is a breach of a warranty, or if there is a misrepresentation or a breach of any term of the agreement. So a well-drafted agreement will always have a well-drafted indemnity clause as well. Now, a typical indemnity clause structure is set out in front of you, and I would ask you to please take 5 seconds and just read this clause. It's a fairly simple clause, and then we can look into some nuances on drafting such clauses. So as you can see in this clause, the sellers are indemnifying the investor. That's the basic idea. For certain losses, claims, damages, liabilities, costs, etc. That is the pool that they had agreed upon. In this, I remember taking this example from a share purchase agreement that we had drafted. The sellers, so in this case, there were many sellers. I think there was 3 sellers, so as to speak. Now, the sellers here jointly and severally agree. Now, this joint and several is a very important concept. And if you are the indemnified party, it is important to consider having joint and several. What this means is that if a seller, suppose you have 3 sellers, and you go to seller A and say, this is my claim notice, pay up. And seller A, say, dies. I'm sorry to be morbid, but he dies. And then you go to seller B and say, this is my claim notice, pay up. And he absconds because he cannot pay. And then you finally go to seller C. So joint and several liability basically means that seller C will not only have to pay for the obligations of A and B, but also himself. So it's joint. And at the same time, it is then up to seller C to decide how he's going to apportion the risk between themselves, between all the sellers. Then we go on to say that the sellers agree to save, indemnify, and hold harmless. The client here had asked me that I understand indemnify. Why do I have to save him? Well, save here is basically understood in a broad context, because indemnity will not only protect you from a loss, an actual loss, but even a liability. So you may not be out of pocket, but even from a liability perspective. Sorry, can we go back to the previous slide? Thank you. So save is important because it has a wider connotation. Hold harmless is also important because hold harmless again has a wide connotation. It not only means that I'm making good the loss, I'm compensating you, but even if I've not actually paid out of my pocket, so I'm not out of pocket, but you still have to indemnify me for the liability. Again, promptly upon demand. So whenever notice claim is made for indemnity, the obligation to pay up is triggered the moment the claim notice is made. And the last point I want you to consider is arising out of or in connection with. Now, arising out of has been held through several case laws to have a very wide connotation. So it does not have to, when you use the term arising out of, it does not, you don't have to show that there is a direct linkage between your misrepresentation and the actual liability or loss. It's a much broader term. And when you use words like in connection with or relating to or in respect of, it's a narrow construction that is given. So these are some small considerations that you have to keep in mind while drafting an indemnity clause. So first of all is, should it be direct, limited to direct losses? We've already discussed this. This is the key distinction between an indemnity and a damage under law, because an indemnity can be a wider pool. You don't even have to restrict it to your direct losses only. You can have indirect consequential losses as well. However, a word of caution, it has now almost become market practice to keep it to direct losses. So even if I was advising the indemnified party, I wouldn't fuss too much about it. I would keep it to direct losses because it's become market practice to have a more fair and balanced indemnity clause. I've already mentioned that indemnities can include third-party claims. So it is important when you're drafting an indemnity clause to also have a very well laid out claim procedure on how third-party claims can be handled. So in a case where, say, you are a contract manufacturer, you are producing something for a FMCG conglomerate, and there is a claim by the final consumer, so that claim can affect you as well as the FMCG person, the business for which you are contracting. And therefore, it is important in such case to figure out who will handle this claim, how will the defense be led, etc. Moving on from indemnity, the indemnity, as we said, is for making good the loss. So for the indemnifying party, the party that has to make good the loss, there are certain tools available to limit your liability, which is known as a limitation of liability clause. And these tools you can basically utilize to ensure that indemnified party does not ask for anything under the sun for which you have to pay up. There is a way to limit these. So first of all is disclosures. We've discussed that whenever you're making a representation or a warranty, you have to disclose, make adequate disclosures, and usually exclude whatever is disclosed from the ambit of your indemnity claim. So if you've disclosed a fact, a liability because of that disclosed fact should not come upon you. There are also concepts of monetary caps. So usually indemnity claim can be capped to a particular amount, which is usually the consideration that comes to you under the contract, or it is a negotiated amount also. You also have concepts of de minimis and basket. Again, these are monetary thresholds. It basically protects you from frivolous claims. So an indemnifying party can say that I'm okay to give you an indemnity protection, but I don't want any claim to come to me if the claim is less than 1 lakh rupees. So that's a de minimis. I'm specifying the base, the floor. And you also have a basket. A basket is nothing but an aggregation of small claims. So you may say that, okay, you may have several small claims of smaller denominations, but I will only pay up when it reaches a ceiling, say, of 5 lakhs. And then I will pay anything beyond 5 lakhs, or I will pay all of it. But it has to reach the 5 lakh amounts. That's another method of limiting liability. Again, you have time caps. Now, if you remember the clause where we had the different bucketing of the representations and warranties into fundamental, tax, and others, the time cap has a lot to do with it. Now, usually under contract, you can prescribe the time period within which you have to make a notice for an indemnity claim. Please be mindful that this is not in any way in restraint of legal proceedings. This is more or less a contractual agreement within which you can make a claim. You can always go to a court within the period of limitation. So usually a tax representation or warranty will, the time period which is prescribed for making a claim is usually anywhere between 6 to 8 years. For others, it can range between 3 to 5 years. Fundamental warranties, we discussed, they were the fundamental to the very core of the contract, usually don't have a time cap, because obviously if I'm selling shares, for example, to you, and there is a defect in the shares I have sold, the whole share purchase agreement is questioned, and therefore usually no time cap is prescribed in such cases. There are certain other standard tools as well where you are allowed a certain cure period within which you can remedy whatever breach has happened. And if you can remedy it, there will be no liability. Finally, I want to speak about the confidentiality clause that Supratim also in his piece alluded to. Confidentiality is now becoming, it's no longer a boilerplate clause that existed somewhere in, towards the end pages of a contract and you would just copy paste it. Supratim would tell you he's actually the national head of our data privacy practice. He would tell you that data is the new oil. And he would tell you that data is king right now. So it is very important for any business to protect their data, to protect the proprietary information, their know-how, the business information that they are disclosing to the other party with whom they are contracting. So from a disclosing party perspective, it is important to have a broad definition of confidential information, which would include any and all information that you are disclosing. But on the other hand, if you're a recipient, you may want to make it a narrow definition because you want to know what you're responsible for and what you're not responsible for. So we have a small example of a very standard and a short confidentiality clause, where we've said that any information received from the other party is confidential. Again, this is obviously pro-disclosure because it's such a big, wide ambit and extent. But if you're on the recipient side, you may want to keep it short and say that only written information or written information clearly marked and identified as confidential will be deemed to be confidential. So just a few thumb rules while defining confidentiality and drafting the clause would be, what information are you protecting? So Pratim had also mentioned from a work from home situation where you don't have physical control, this becomes increasingly important. It's also important to show some compliance checks and balances. So it may be a good idea if you are a discloser of information to put in checks and balances, ask for certain information rights, ask for certain audit rights, so that you can show that you are in compliance, which is what I understand the law also requires. So what are the exclusions? It's also important to draft your exclusions very well. So if you need to further disseminate this confidential information to your employees, mention that. Mention you're going to do it on a need to know basis, or to an agent. Then mention how that is going to be done. It is also important for a confidentiality clause to survive the termination so that you have a larger period or tenure of protection, especially if the information is highly proprietary or sensitive in nature. Finally, I want to talk about certain post-COVID takeaways really. If you are in a situation where you have signed an agreement, you have given your reps and warranties, you are negotiating a particular agreement, certain to-dos from a seller and buyer perspective, we would urge you to relook at your representations and warranties, ensure that you have enough qualifiers built in, like the ones we discussed, which allows you to save yourself from any breach. Ensure that you have disclosures. If you have gone past the stage of negotiating your reps and warranties, make sure you have the ability to give the disclosures whenever the need arises. You could also consider carve-outs where you're specifically carving out certain events that are arising during this period, and of course, negotiate on your limitations of liability well. From a buyer's perspective, it is important that you have some avenue to have a specific indemnity. A specific indemnity is an indemnity, but it says that no matter what limitation of liability you have, no matter what disclosure you make, you will be liable to indemnify you. So it gives a better level of protection. And again, of course, negotiate your limitations of liability and your risk allocation provisions. I appreciate that I'm almost running out of time, so I'm going to quickly talk about the material adverse change clause. Now, material adverse change, as we know, and my colleague Nandini is also going to talk about it when she talks about force majeure after this, is a clause that is a buzzword right now because many buyers are seeking an exit route by using these clauses. Now, we have live examples of this, especially in more developed markets, but we are seeing examples everywhere. We've had cases where Xerox has ended its hostile takeover of HP because of the COVID situation. Grey TV's acquisition of Tegna in the US, which was a multi-million-dollar acquisition, fell out because of COVID. Again, there was a talk about buying out Victoria's Secret from L Brands. That also supposedly has fallen through. So you can clearly see how people are utilizing this. Material adverse change is really nothing. It is a clause that is found usually in financing documents as well as in M&A related documents. And the concept, it basically tells you that if certain events happen, which will materially and adversely affect you and your business and certain specified metrics like your operations, net worth, assets, etc. The consequence usually is that you can have a variety of consequences, of course, but one key consequence could be that the buyer can walk out of the deal and can seek to exit, and of course seek other remedies as well. This was a clause that we have recently drafted, and I want to take you through it quickly through a seller and a buyer perspective. I would ask you to just read the second bullet point here. Now, because this was a seller-friendly draft, the first bullet point basically identified what is a material adverse change. And it says that any change that materially adversely affects business operations, etc., is material adverse change. The second bullet point basically had some carve-outs, and it said that certain events, if it happens, will not be a material adverse change. These are certain standard events like change in applicable law. It also had natural disasters, earthquakes, hurricanes, so any disaster, any disruption caused by the cyclone that we just had in West Bengal would possibly be out of it. What they had done is also included pandemic, epidemic, public health emergency within it. Because it's a seller-friendly draft, you want to also include it in your exclusions, so that any disruption caused because of your pandemic, public health emergency, the coronavirus is going to be specifically excluded. And also matters disclosed in the disclosure letter. So if you are drafting a seller-friendly clause like this, I would ask you to make it as detailed as possible. Maybe even have a specific reference to Corona and SARS for that matter, because it seems that this problem is not going to end in the near future. But on the other hand, if we had to draft a buyer-friendly draft, and assuming you had the same clause in front of you, the way to narrow this, the exclusion further would be to include the language that I have highlighted here. So basically, it says the same things. It says that while this is your definition of your material adverse change, any occurrence of an earthquake, hurricane, natural disaster, public health emergency, coronavirus are exclusions, provided, and this is key, where we've said that provided that this change development, basically this coronavirus, this pandemic, this public health emergency, disproportionately affects your company and your subsidiaries as opposed to the other. So if you're the other side, you're the buyer side or the investor side, what this would mean is that if you want a way out of a particular agreement, you want to exit because it's clearly not making any business sense for you, then in that case, it will say that fine, you can take help of this exclusion, but you have to show how you are disproportionately affected as compared to your competitors, to your peers in the industry. So if you are a restaurant, you please show that how you are disproportionately affected and not the other restaurants or the F&B industry in general. So this is one way to narrow the definition of MAC. And with that, I end my slot, and I'm going to ask Nandini to take over on the very interesting topics of force majeure and, of course, arbitration. Over to you, Nandini.
Thank you, Suhana. Is Tejas taking the control? Hello?
Yes, Nandini, I have changed the slide. Do you want to go to the next
Can
one?
you go back to the previous one?
Previous one, yeah.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you, Suhana. The principle and clauses discussed by my partners are for when parties are entering into an agreement or a marriage, so to speak. The topics that I'm going to deal with in my time is when the marriage is headed for trouble or even a split. That is to say, the force majeure and arbitration clauses. I will first deal with the drafting of a force majeure clause and then the arbitration agreement. Next slide. Force majeure, as we all know, is the latest buzzword in the legal and business circles. We have discussed the basic principles of the force majeure clause for the ICC members a few weeks back, and today we will concentrate on the drafting part of it. However, we will touch upon the basic concept for those people who have joined in afresh on this webinar. The FM clause is defined by the dictionary, as you can see on your screen, as allocating the risk of loss if performance becomes impossible or impracticable in cases of an event that could not have been anticipated or controlled. Please mark the words anticipated or controlled here. We will discuss them a bit more ahead. There are two standards that we look at when we are discussing the issue of force majeure. The first is the contractual standard. Here, the principle is that contract is king, which means the interpretation of the force majeure clause will depend on the language of the contract only. Please note, this is generally a narrow interpretation attempting to give effect to the intentions of the party at the time of entering into the contract and not when the force majeure actually happens. If there is no force majeure clause or the clause is not attracted to the facts of the case, this could be, for example, it's applicable only to one party perhaps, then the second standard is relied upon, which is the statutory standard or the frustration concept. This standard rests on the impossibility of performance and is a higher threshold usually than the contractual one. Section 56 of the Contract Act deals with the frustration principles with regards to all agreements except for leases. Leases, in fact, falls under Section 108 of the Transfer of Property Act. Please note, a leave and license agreement would also actually fall under the Contract Act and not under the TP Act. Next slide, please. Before we look at tips for drafting, it would be useful to spend just a few minutes on various types of force majeure clauses that we have looked at in the recent past. Here we have tried to represent 3 clauses which are commonly found in agreements and ranging from a widely worded clause to a narrowly worded one. The first clause, the blue one, is a widely worded clause. It reads, force majeure means any event including, the word including is important here, acts of God or other events beyond the reasonable control, which is basically a catch-all phrase, the or other events. It may be possible to argue that the pandemic or COVID is included in this definition. Next, we will look at the third clause first. This reads, force majeure shall mean war, armed conflict, flood, terrorist, and so on. Here, there is no catch-all phrase. It is an exhaustive definition, and there is no scope for including any other event like a pandemic. So it's very narrow. The second clause is a mix of the 2 clauses which we just saw, and is usually the most common one. Here it reads, force majeure means and includes, so it is an inclusive definition again, and then it names certain events like lightning, earthquake, tempest, cyclone, and so on. And then there is a catch-all phrase and all other events. Please, however, please note the catch-all phrase here is preceded, sorry, can we go back to the previous slide? Yes, we were discussing the second slide here, the second clause here. The catch-all phrase in the second clause is preceded by these words which we discussed: lightning, earthquake, tempest, cyclone, volcanic eruptions, and so on. In such a case, the maxim adjustum generis comes into play, and the catch-all phrase will take color or meaning from the words before it. So, while tsunami could be included in the interpretation as flood is included in the specific mentions, or for that matter, terrorism could be included as war is, a pandemic in this case will also not be included. Next clause, next slide, please. Here we will look at some general principles of drafting the force majeure clauses and then customizing it to your situation. In the general rules in drafting and invocation, we'll first look at drafting. The most important part of the FM clause is the definition of itself, as it indicates the intentions of the parties to be released from their obligations only in certain scenarios. And we've just seen 2 or 3 examples of those. This gives the contract a certain level of predictability on both sides, and that is why the courts will interpret this narrowly and has done so historically all this while. Notice, there must be a provision for providing notice for invocation of the force majeure clause if a party wants to get out of performing its obligations. The notice should state the exact reason for non-performance. Very often we see vague notices like, due to force majeure, I cannot perform. This will fail in court, so it should be avoided. Electronic delivery of notice is fine as long as it's to an official email ID or one that is used by the counterparty regularly. Proof of the force majeure. Now, one may ask that why do we need a proof of force majeure when everybody seems to be suffering it? Well, the reason is that it can be relevant in situations when the problem is, say, only in one area and the other side does not know about it, and it will want proof that the force majeure event actually happened. For example, the Amphan cyclone that has happened in West Bengal has had very little coverage nationally and absolutely no coverage internationally despite its severity. So if there was a supply contract from the supplier in West Bengal to America, and he was not able to supply due to Amphan, and he invoked the force majeure clause. The other side may want a proof that it actually happened. In such a case, a proof of force majeure may be needed. In this regard, the Chinese government has been handing out force majeure certificates to companies who are wanting to invoke the clause. On the specifics of invocation, in interest of time, I am not dealing with it since it's already been dealt below. I am straight away going in, sorry, I missed out on consequences of FM. This is an important part of the clause and the contract at large. It deals with what happens if there is invocation of the force majeure clause successfully. It generally means that there will be a suspension of the obligations of parties. Sometimes time is extended for performance, and sometimes the contract is allowed to be terminated without damages. So consequences should be built into the clause. Otherwise, it kind of leaves open a very ambiguous situation as to what happens if the force majeure is invoked. I will straight away come into the customization part now. This is a broad-based discussion, I caution in this regard, and it is advisable that you seek counsel, legal counsel on the facts of your case, because these are very broad principles that we are discussing here. Now, in the previous slide, we looked at what a wide or a widely worded clause looked like. So these widely worded clause may be used by sellers, as there could be many situations where it is unable to supply and would not want to be in breach of obligations, especially in time-sensitive contracts. Tenants may want very wide definitions for their agreements to avoid heavy payments of rent during a crisis situation. If a part of the rent can be tied to revenue, then and if there is no revenue, then some part of the rent could be saved, but this is usually difficult to negotiate. For a widely worded clause, use wider terms like including but not limited to, use catch-all phrases, and act of God. Act of God generally sort of takes into account natural calamities and will be interpreted only in that scope. Tenants must have a FM clause, because if you don't have an FM clause, then you fall back under section 108 of the Transfer of Property Act, which only deals with destruction of property, which may not be the case in situations like COVID. Then we come to the narrowly worded clauses. In these clauses, can we just go back to the previous slide, please? Thank you. Yeah. If you have, for narrowly worded clauses, these may be relevant for situations where you have already performed your obligations and are due to receive money. Then a narrow clause or even no clause is fine. When I say already performed your obligation, it basically means that if suppose it's a lender and his only obligation is to provide loan or money, then it's very easy that he would just have to sit back and wait for the money to come back. Landlords. Now, even for landlords, it should be very, very narrowly worded, because if there is no clause or a narrowly worded clause, then the tenants cannot use force majeure for non-payment of rent. The only obligation that a landlord has really under the Transfer of Property Act is providing a habitable premises. In this case, avoid words like act of God and catch-all phrases. Buyers would generally require a narrow clause because they would want the supply, but a word of caution here that once the goods have been supplied and the COVID or a pandemic or any force majeure event occurs after that, and there are clauses like FOB and CIF, a buyer cannot get out of his contract, because economic hardship is not a reason to invoke force majeure clauses. A very interesting point in this regard that we have seen is in the context of insolvency in the account of insolvency. Resolution applicants who are bidding for insolvent companies in a COVID situation, they would have bid 2 months back and given a bank guarantee, and normally they would not be allowed to withdraw the application. But what was happened is that in 2 months, the company that they bid on would have been unoperational, and that can cause some material adverse effect to the production or to the company's plant or something, or even to its pricing. And in such a case, the bidder may want to back out, and this would give it some leeway. One last tip here is that please take into account the local area or the industry specific issues that crop up. You may specifically want to include them in your force majeure clause, or for that matter specifically exclude them, because if you know that a situation is very rampant in a particular area or in a particular industry and you're still contracting, then you would want your vendor to not take the excuse of that particular situation, like a very strike prone area, to get out of the performance of its contract. Next slide, please. Very quick, next slide, please. Very quickly, I want to just show you here the International Chamber of Commerce, ICC, the other ICC's short form model clause for a force majeure event clause. It talks about the occurrence of an event that prevents performance, and it's basically the dictionary definition taken into account here as well. I would again ask you to mark the words "could not reasonably have been foreseen" and "beyond reasonably controlled." I'll just get to it. Please look at the highlighted words. These are the specific events that the ICC covers. It ranges from war, currency fluctuations, plague, natural disasters, industrial explosions, and general labor issues. Next slide, please. And then it also covers the consequences of a force majeure event in case it's invoked. Next slide. While this is a model clause given by the ICC itself, I would like you all to just look at 2 points here. Firstly, this is a short form and it's exhaustive. It does not have a catch-all phrase. And secondly, it talks about foreseeability. And in certain situations where the person is resisting a force majeure clause, I would always argue that this was foreseeable and hence not a force majeure clause invocation, a correct invocation. For example, today, if I got into a new contract and there's another wave of COVID in December, I could argue that this was foreseeable. So maybe foreseeability can cut both ways, and a better test perhaps in certain situations could be beyond reasonable control. The next part is on queries on FM inclusions. These are actual questions that we have received in the last 2 months. They pertain to radiation, animal attacks, and there was an elephant rampage in the southern part of India which destroyed a person's plantation, and he wanted to claim force majeure. Plane crashes, now that will not only affect the people on the plane and the cargo on plane, but also the site of crash, because it affects the people there. And yes, we were also asked about aliens. So the list is endless, and with this I conclude my portion on force majeure. Next slide, please. Here I will quickly get into the concept of arbitration. The arbitration agreement is governed in India under the Arbitration and Conciliation Act, as we all know. The agreement or the clause, though usually a part of the part of a larger contract for commercial terms, it is considered a separate contract and has its own set of rules. The first thing that has to be done is to choose between an ad hoc and institutional arbitration. Ad hoc has generally been the more popular form in India, where the tribunal, the arbitrators set the rules of procedure. In the case of institutional arbitration, there is a specific set of guidelines which the parties and the tribunal has to follow. The advantages of an institutional arbitration is that there is a predictability in the rules of procedure and evidence, as CPC is not followed strictly. In situations like COVID lockdowns, institutions have the capability of appointing emergency arbitrators within 2 days for urgent reliefs. Examples of institutions are International Chamber of Commerce, SIAC, and so on. If the claim is small, it may be better to go for an ad hoc arbitration as there is a cost involved. On language, please use clear and simple language and avoid ambiguity. While this may seem to be a simple enough suggestion, we have seen many arbitration agreements which have in fact raised very serious issues on the very existence of the agreement, and we shall examine a few such vague clauses later in the presentation. The scope. One may ask, what is scope of the arbitration? It basically means what topics can be taken under the arbitration for adjudication. We advise that please keep the scope of arbitration agreement wide enough to even include the very issue of validity of the agreement of arbitration. This is because at the time of entering into the agreement, you do not know if you will be a claimant or a respondent. And if you are a claimant, it is better to litigate in an arbitration given the delay in the civil courts. Please remember the rights in rem, which basically means enforceable against the world, like criminal offenses barring fraud. Simple fraud, marital issues, oppression, mismanagement, insolvency cannot be arbitrated. Certain sectors like insurance have very restrictive clauses where only the quantum can be arbitrated and not on whether there is a liability in the first place. Seat. This is perhaps the most important part of an arbitration agreement. The seat attracts the procedural law, and as we said, the arbitration agreement has its own set of procedural law, and we will discuss this in detail in the next slide. Governing law, this is not a very important aspect for domestic arbitrations because it's usually the same as a substantive law of the contract itself. It only takes importance if there is an international commercial arbitration where there is another party who is not Indian. Another important aspect is that the arbitration agreement has to be in writing. Please note the words in writing, which basically means that it has to be accepted by both parties in any written form, whether it's by signatures or simply an electronic exchange of documents where both agree to be bound electronically. This is especially important and relevant in today's day and age where situations like lockdowns happen and an exchange of signed documents may not take place. So for example, just yesterday, I signed a mandate letter with a client just by saying on email that this is the draft and we agree that this is the final version of it. Language. Now, while this may seem very intuitive, again, that it's an English language usually, please remember that if it's an international commercial arbitration with multinationality, it's important that you have, it may be important that you have a parallel language as well for the purpose of enforcement in that country. An example would be that if there is a China-seated arbitration, then the award should parallelly be passed in Chinese and in English so that the enforcement in China is made easy with the Chinese part of the award and no interpretation issue arises due to translations which may be privately procured. Next slide, please. Here we look at the importance. So in the earlier slide, we dealt with all the elements of an arbitration agreement. Now we deal with the concept of seat, which is the most important part of an arbitration agreement, arguably. The seat attracts the procedural law for the arbitration process. So we always suggest that please state specifically that the seat of arbitration shall be Delhi or Calcutta or London or wherever you may choose to seat it. In domestic arbitrations, we'll deal with domestic first. In domestic arbitrations, your choice of seat, which is basically the city effectively, it will decide which court will have the power to pass urgent reliefs under Section 9 of the Arbitration Act. So if you choose that the arbitration will be seated in Delhi, then the Section 9 for urgent reliefs will be filed in Delhi and passed by the Delhi courts. Similarly, the challenge to an award will also be in Delhi court in the same example. There has been some development in the jurisprudence around neutral venues. By neutral venues, I mean is that if one party is in Bombay and one party is in Delhi, the defendant is in Delhi, and the cause of action happened in Delhi or in Bombay, but the parties choose Calcutta as the seat of arbitration. Now, earlier there was jurisprudence to imply that you could not choose a neutral venue. You could choose between Bombay and Delhi which one to be as your seat, but you couldn't choose Calcutta. But now there is some jurisprudence to suggest that a neutral venue in the case of a domestic arbitration can be chosen. We cannot emphasize this enough, that please do not use seat, place and venue interchangeably. If you are, one party is in Bombay and one party is in Delhi, you can choose Delhi to be your seat, but for convenience sake, if you want to also save costs and have certain hearings in Bombay, say the venue for convenience is Bombay for in X number of hearings. We will see a few clauses later on where we've seen a problem happened despite choosing venues as seats. In an international commercial arbitration where the seat is outside India, please note that Part 1 of the Arbitration Act, which deals with the interim reliefs as we discussed, challenge to the award, Section 27, which deals with taking evidence, are open to the party to come to India to seek these reliefs. Now, unless it is specifically excluded. So when two parties are in an international, are seeking to contract an international commercial arbitration clause, and they are seating it in Paris or London or Singapore, you may have to look at whether there are assets in India which you might want to attach, or for that matter, want to defend. So if you want to attach those assets, then you should not say Part 1 is excluded. But if you think that you may be proceeded against and you do not want your assets in India attached, then say Part 1 is excluded. Please also give relevance to the local laws of the country where the seat is, because that may have some bearing on how the procedure of the arbitration will move. For example, though UAE, Dubai is not a reciprocal country, in Dubai, an award has to be at a second layer of ratification, ratified by the local courts of Dubai before it can be sent out for enforcement in another country. So small things like this can be time consuming and counterproductive to any urgent enforcement issues that may come up. Now on the enforcement of the foreign award itself, suppose your award was seated in any of these countries like London or Singapore, the enforcement when it comes to India will only enforce it if it has a reciprocity with that particular country. So if you are seeking to enforce an award in India, please make sure that the country that the arbitration was seated in has a reciprocal arrangement with India. Again, it can work both ways. If you want the enforcement not to happen in India directly or easily, choose a country that does not have a reciprocity arrangement with India under the New York Convention. Next slide, please. So I discussed with you all earlier that we will look at some clauses to see how well they were drafted or whether they were vague. I will request you all to take about 30 to 40 seconds to read all these 3 clauses, and then we will take a poll to see which of the clauses were well drafted and which were not. So can I request you all to please read them in 30 to 40 seconds, please. Okay, so can we have the poll question, please, now? How many of those 3 clauses did you think were well drafted? 1 of them, 2 of them, all 3 of them, or none of them? So if you can just take the poll. So if we've received the poll answers, can we just show the answers, please? Okay, so most said that 1 clause was well drafted. 36%, which is the majority, said 2 of them were drafted. Only 4% said that all were well drafted, and 27% said that none of them were well drafted. Well, next slide, please. Let me tell you, those who marked that none of them were well drafted are correct. Let's quickly look at them again. In the India Infoline case, please look at the underlined portion. All arbitration proceedings shall take place in Delhi or such a place as may be decided by the lender in its sole discretion. Here, there was no contrary indication that there was a separate seat. But what happened was that the Delhi High Court held that because the cause of action and the defendant was in Bombay, the word place here was really a venue and not the seat, and the Section 9 failed. There has been some new development in the BGS Soma case, after which this clause could have perhaps held good even in the Delhi High Court, but this is the result that happened prior to the BGS Soma case. In the Jagdish Chandar versus Ramesh Chandar case, it was held that the arbitration clause is not binding because it says shall be mutually decided by the parties or shall be referred for arbitration if the parties so determine. So that's not binding. In the third case of System for International Agencies, there is no such thing as arbitration under the bylaws of Indian Companies Act. And there is also nothing as arbitration as per the international trade laws. Hence, the clause was held to be vague and was not given effect to. Can we see the next slide, please? This is a model clause that we suggest. Very quickly, it covers all the elements that we covered in the first slide. Arising under or in connection with goes to the scope of the arbitration agreement. Including makes it very wide. Then we look at the mechanism for appointing the arbitrator, whether it's a sole arbitrator or 3 arbitrators. I forgot to mention at the time of discussing the key elements of arbitration agreement that the appointment of arbitrators can only be an odd number and not an even number, and as per the Act. And the parties are able to choose how they wish to go about it, whether they want a sole arbitrator or more. The language of the arbitration, as we discussed, shall be. The governing law is only important if it's an international commercial arbitration. Next slide, please. Here we will quickly look at some practical issues. In a lot of agreements, you will see multi-tier arbitration clauses, where you have something like a mediation or a negotiation which has to precede the arbitration. We do not advise this only because in cases of urgent arbitration invocations, it will require a good faith mediation or negotiation to have taken place before arbitration can be proceeded with. Now, stamp and registration is a very important point. It can be looked at from 2 perspectives. Now, even though we said that arbitration agreements are a separate contract, if the contract itself is not correctly stamped, even the arbitration agreement cannot be looked into. That's from the agreement's validity perspective. So please make sure that the main contract is properly stamped. Then from the award perspective, a lot of times the award, if it partitions immovable property, it may be stamped as a partition and it can invite a very high amount of stamp value. For example, a recent arbitration that we did, the award had a stamp value of 3 crores and upwards. So it may be relevant, it may be a good idea to have an agreement in the contract itself, how the awards stamping and registration will be shared. Virtual courts, in the time of COVID or even going forward, there's a lot of discussion on virtual courts and hearings to be taken place on video calls to save costs. It might be prudent in that case to have a video protocol in your arbitration agreement itself, or at least make the tribunal put it in the first meeting itself. When we discussed in the previous slide on how arbitrators are to be nominated by an odd number, please avoid naming an arbitrator, because that can lead to a lot of problems later on. For example, if you have gotten into the contract or the arbitration agreement on January 1st, 2019, and disputes arise in May 2020, that arbitrator by then could have died, sorry to be morbid again, could have been incapacitated, or in that much time could have become an employee, or for that matter, a advisor to one of the parties, and that would render it, it would disqualify him under the schedules of the Arbitration Act. A small point here, that under the amendments of the Arbitration Act, an employee or advisor cannot be an arbitrator. There has to be mutual consent. In earlier cases, in railway procurement contracts, the railway engineer or somebody from the railway department only used to be appointed the arbitrator. That can no longer be done. Very quickly on the multi-party, multi-document point. Now, there are a lot of times in complicated shareholder agreements or construction agreements, there are multiple agreements or multiple parties. In such a case, we advise that please have the same arbitration clause across the documents so that there is no confusion. In a recent construction arbitration, we saw that the main, the umbrella document had an institutional ICC arbitration agreement clause, and the subset agreement had a UNICITRAL institutional arbitration clause. One of them was seated in India and one of them was seated outside India, leading to a lot of confusion. So please be careful on that front. Sometimes an institutional arbitration will allow for consolidation if there are multiple agreements, but all arising from the same legal relationships. That may not be possible in an ad hoc arbitration clause proceeding. So these are the basic points that I wish to cover for arbitration. And I will be happy to take questions on these issues now. Thank you.
Thank you, Nandini. That was fantastic. I think a lot of questions are coming through. I would start looking at these. Maybe the first few, let me try and answer. So one question is, could you please explain briefly about the bring down warranty with an example? Well, very good question. I think, when we do have representations and warranties, on the date of signing a document, we vouch, or the seller vouches that, yes, I have been compliant with all applicable laws. I have, I have every license, every labor license, for example, in place, etc. And then some time passes by, whilst the parties are completing their conditions precedent, and then the final closing or changing of hands of money and shares or money and assets or business take place. Now, that is a real closing date, right? So what we do is on that day, again, we do try to take another bring down, notice is signed by the sellers again, where the seller again vouches that whatever I told you on the day of signing, that I have been compliant with all laws, I have been following every labor law, everything, that is still true and correct. And that is the notice that we take and keep, because that's again a sign off on that day. The next question is, can you write to the best of my knowledge, for example, for complying with laws? Well, compliance, so first, ignorance of law is cannot be an excuse. That's a separate question. But when you are putting together your representations and warranties, and you are putting your carve-outs also on that, you always have a situation where someone is doing the fact finding and vouching for it, right? So usually what we would see is if there is a particular kind of fact finding which is being talked about, you can, in most of the cases, put a caveat of to the best of my knowledge. For example, to the best of my knowledge, I'm aware that there is no threatened litigation. That is kind of an acceptable position in the market, that I don't know whether something is threatened. Okay. To the best of my knowledge, I am telling you I'm compliant with applicable law is not a market position, is not something which is too palatable. But where you can really logically argue it out is something like the example that I gave you. Is suppose there is a threatened litigation, you can always say, to the best of my knowledge, I am not aware of any threatened litigation. With that, I will move on to the next question, and this is for Suhana. What can be agreed for limitation of liability?
Okay, thank you, Supratim. So what can be agreed as a limit of your liability, and I'm assuming you're talking about the monetary caps that we had discussed, is very simply put subject to pure commercial discussion. So this is an aspect which will typically be decided based on the commercial comfort of both parties, and especially, of course, the party that has to indemnify. And this is going to be typically very highly negotiated. Having said that, usually we have seen, and if you remember, we had discussed the various buckets of representations and warranties. For fundamental warranties, again, usually there was no cap. No cap can be prescribed monetarily, because obviously the grievance caused would be very, very high and of a critical nature. But for the others, you could agree to a cap which was, capped to the monetary threshold, or the amount could be a hard amount. So it has to be something which is, like a predetermined amount that you put in figures, and usually this could be your, the consideration that you're receiving under the agreement. So if it's a master supply agreement, the total value of that agreement, or if it is some, say, sale of shares, it could be the consideration that you're receiving under that. But again, this is a negotiated position. You could have a final limit of liability which is a lower amount as well. So sometimes we've also seen for tax representations and warranties, there is sometimes an uncapped amount as well, though that's not very market practice. So this is purely a commercial call, really.
Thank you, Suhana. There's another question for you. Can limitations be to the extent of damages awarded by courts of competent jurisdiction?
Okay, that's a very interesting question, actually. And, I'm assuming, again, the presumption here is that you're talking about third-party claims. Now, for third-party claims, if we take a step back, we had said that now it's again become market practice that your indemnity claim and the losses are usually confined to your direct loss, or your direct whatever expense and cost that you incur. And in that case, it is possible, I would say, for the indemnifying party to say that if there is a third-party claim, I will be liable to you only to the extent of damages that a court is going to award. And that is very pro-indemnifying party, and that could be used as a stance. However, having said that, we have also seen cases, especially when we draft third-party claims and the entire procedure. If you remember, I had said that the obligation for an indemnity claim and to indemnify is usually triggered at the time you make the notice, irrespective of the outcome of the actual procedure or the litigation that may happen. And if, unfortunately, your clause is drafted in such a manner, of course, unfortunately, fortunately, I say, depending on which side you are on. So if the clause is drafted in such a manner where, the liability to pay up will trigger immediately, then we have also seen cases where the indemnified party, the other party, says that you pay up whatever is the amount of the third party claim to me, and then let the matter be decided in a court of law, let it take its own course. And depending on the final damages, so it may be a satisfactory decision or a non-favorable or non-favorable. If it is favorable, I will return that amount to you. If it is not favorable, then, depending on the actual damages, you may need to pay me more, or I may need to, set off or pay you back some amount. So in a sense, for third party claims, it is possible, I would say. So
Thank you so much, Suhana. So I have a host of questions for Nandini. I'll start with this one. Two divergent views on COVID-19. Whilst Delhi High Court considers it force majeure, but Bombay High Court has not considered it force majeure. We are in a fix. So in the agreement, we will be mentioning the clause of pandemic and lockdown also.
Thank you,
Nandini.
Supratim. Yeah, thank you. It's not that there are divergent views of Bombay High Court and Delhi High Court. Bombay High Court has so far, in most of the agreements, in most of the cases, allowed some sort of status quo to be maintained. The case of Standard Retail, which was one of the first cases that went to court for some kind of a relief, there it was not given because the buyer wanted to get out of his obligation to buy steel. Steel was considered an essential commodity, and there was no restriction on the movement for people who were buying and selling steel. And on that basis, Bombay High Court refused relief, to the buyer. And economic hardship cannot be a reason. We have already discussed this in the presentation. So in fact, Delhi High Court in Indranil Power has also rejected relief to the petitioner who was trying to stop the enforcement of bank guarantees, saying that the dues were overdue from over a year and they cannot take advantage of the COVID situation right now. But by and large, most courts, including both Bombay and Delhi High Courts, have allowed status quo to be maintained till the lockdown is over or the moratorium is there. So they have stopped NPAs to be, they have stopped companies from being declared as NPAs and so on. So it's really a fact-based situation, and it's not that the courts have taken a specific situation, specific stand on the same. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, thank you, Nandini. The next question is also to you. In an agreement, if nothing is specifically mentioned in the force majeure clause, can any party take the shelter of COVID-19?
So I will assume this to mean that there is a force majeure clause, and the clause is narrow and there is no COVID-19 interpreted from the clause. In such a case, there is no way that you can use COVID-19 as a force majeure to get out of your obligations. However, we would have to look at the clause. If it is widely worded, as we looked at in the buckets that we saw on various clauses, then we can try and interpret it in the catch-all phrase.
Thank you. And then another question. Sometimes payment obligations continue in case of FM clause. Your views, please.
Yes, we are seeing a lot of queries around this issue, that we are having to continue to pay, whether it's wages, whether it's rent, whether it's to a vendor on a minimum payment obligation basis. These unfortunately will continue to take place, and payment has to continue because economic hardship is so. A payment, just a payment in principle, is usually not within the purview of a force majeure clause unless specifically excluded, or it's tied into some sort of revenue generation part in the clause itself.
Right,
the best thing I can advise in these situations is private negotiation, because that's what everybody seems to be doing currently.
Thank you, Nandini. There's, we are running out of time, but we'll take maybe only a couple of more questions.
Yeah, sure.
So This question is for you. Does suspension of obligations during force majeure mean waiver? That is, parties are not obliged to perform obligations during such period. Example, suspension of payment of rent during force majeure. I think.
No, suspension really just means that there is a suspension for some time. The obligation to perform your duty does not go away. It will have to be done once the force majeure event is lifted. By and large, this is the guiding principle. And this also will be only if the consequences of the force majeure is built into the clause.
Right. I think we'll take just one more question before we wrap up. And this is, can the effective date be prior to execution date in an agreement? Yes, it can be, depending on scenario. That is also a possibility. So I think with this, we will wrap it up for today. Thank you, everyone, ladies and gentlemen, for, again, your collective time. I hope that, you have really gained out of this. We at, Khaitan and Company, we are extremely grateful to all of you that, you have invested this time. I will now hand it back to Tejas for the final housekeeping declarations.
Thank you, Supratim, and thank you to all the panelists and the ICC team for helping us put together this presentation. Like at the end, we would like to receive your feedback on this webinar. We will we'll put a short poll on your screen right now. And I request you to send us your feedback by clicking on the screen. And once you shut down this webinar portal, you will also get a short survey. And we request you to fill that up as well. I'll just remind everyone that the presentation and the recording of this webinar will be emailed to you, but it will take us some time. So it will get to you in about a week's time. And so that's about it. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Thank you, ICC. Thank you, speakers and participants. Thank you, Tejas.